Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I asked the Ouija board about my future. It spelled out my final moments. Alright, so this is a weird story. I don't really believe in ghosts or anything like that. But after what happened to me, I'm starting to question everything I thought I knew. I guess I'll start with the basics. My name's Ryan. I'm 22, live in a quiet town, work an office job. Pretty average life, right? Well, that was until a few months ago. It all started one of those nights when you're bored out of your mind. You know the kind I mean. The ones where you're scrolling through your phone, trying to find something, anything to do. My roommate, Mark, was out of town for the weekend, so I was alone in the apartment. It was a Saturday night, and instead of going out like a normal person, I was glued to my couch, flipping through Netflix for the 800th time. After realizing I wasn't going to find anything interesting, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened up my laptop and started browsing the internet. I don't know what got into me, but I found myself on Reddit, looking at creepy forums, reading all these bizarre stories about people finding weird stuff on the deep web. Some were obviously fake, but a few of them, man, they got under my skin. I read this one story about a guy who claimed he found a haunted Ouija board for sale on some sketchy deep web marketplace. He said the board was cursed, that it spelled out his death date, and then he died a week later. Total nonsense, right? Still, the post made my skin crawl, and instead of closing my laptop and doing something productive, I decided to take things a step further. Now, I'm not proud of this, but I've dabbled in some shady corners of the web before. Nothing illegal or whatever, but, you know, curiosity gets the best of you. So I fired up Tor, a browser for accessing the deep web for those who don't know, and started digging around, half jokingly looking for a Ouija board like the one from the story. I swear, it felt like I was scrolling for hours, finding nothing but random weird junk. Fake IDs, sketchy VPN services, illegal animal trading, you name it. But just as I was about to call it quits, something caught my eye. It was a plain black and white listing, nothing fancy, but the title, it sent chills down my spine. Authentic Ouija board, know your future, meet your end. At first, I thought it was some lame prank. I mean, who even sells Ouija boards on the deep web? But the description was what hooked me. It said, this board doesn't just contact the dead. It tells you how you die. Detailed, specific, final. I laughed because, yeah, it was ridiculous. But it was late. I was alone, and maybe a little too curious for my own good. So, what did I do? I bought it. Don't ask me why. I don't even know myself. Maybe I thought it would be a funny story to tell later, or maybe I was just bored enough to take the bait. But within minutes of purchasing it, I got an email from an address that looked like it had been scrambled by a toddler. The message was short. Shipping within 3 days. Don't play alone. Don't play alone. That part stood out to me, but I brushed it off. 3 days later, the Ouija board arrived. And trust me, this thing wasn't your run-of-the-mill toy store version. It looked old, like really old. The wood was dark, worn, and the planchette was carved out of what looked like bone. There were no instructions, no packaging, just the board and the planchette wrapped in some kind of tattered cloth. I should have tossed it, but of course I didn't. That night, I texted Mark to tell him about it, thinking he'd find it as funny as I did. But instead, he just sent back a single message. Dude, don't mess with that stuff. Trust me. I was a little taken aback. Mark wasn't the superstitious type at all, so for him to warn me like that, it stuck with me. But again, I ignored it. I figured I'd try it out, just to see if anything weird happened. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? Well, I would find out soon enough. So, That night, after a couple beers to calm the nerves, I set up the board on my coffee table. Yeah, I know, I'm an idiot. But I was still convinced it was just some elaborate scam. I lit a couple candles, not because I thought I'd summon any spirits or whatever, but because the room was too dim to see the letters clearly. I remember it was a little after midnight when I placed my fingers on the planchette and asked the first question, "Is anyone here?" At first, nothing happened. I sat there for a solid 2 minutes, fingers on the planchette, feeling like an absolute moron. But then, it started to move. Slowly, at first. My heart skipped a beat, but I convinced myself I was probably pushing it without realizing it. The planchette slid across the board, spelling out a single word. Yes, I chuckled nervously. "Okay, real funny," I said to the empty room. "Let's try something else." I leaned forward, my fingers still resting on the planchette. I was going to ask about my future, because I figured that's what people do with these things. I was expecting something vague and cliché like, "You'll find love," or "You'll get rich." But I didn't get that. I asked the Ouija board, "How am I going to die?" For a few moments, nothing happened. The candles flickered, and I felt this sudden, sharp chill in the air. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the beers were making me paranoid. But then, the planchette started moving again. It was faster this time, more deliberate. My fingers felt like they were glued to it, like I couldn't let go even if I wanted to. It spelled out, "Tonight." And that's when everything started to go wrong. As soon as the planchette slid to the word "tonight," a sinking feeling hit me, like a lead weight in my stomach. It's hard to describe, but the air around me felt wrong. Thick, almost. Like the atmosphere had suddenly shifted. The candles on the table flickered again, but this time I couldn't brush it off as a draft. There were no windows open, no fans. The room was completely still. I sat there, staring at the board, trying to convince myself that it was all a joke. I mean, I had to be pushing the planchette without realizing it, right? That's how these things work. Subconscious movement, or whatever. But my hands were sweating now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't want to touch the board anymore. Honestly, I should have stopped right there, but some part of me, probably the same stupid part that bought the thing in the first place, wanted to keep going. Maybe I thought if I kept asking, I could prove to myself it was all just a mind game. But deep down, I knew better. The temperature in the room had dropped. I was wearing a hoodie, but suddenly, I was shivering. I decided to ask another question, just one more. My voice was shaky, and I could barely get the words out, but I forced myself to ask, Who's here with me? The planchette didn't wait this time. It moved with a force that almost felt like it was being yanked. It shot across the board, quickly spelling out the letters. D-E-A-T-H. I yanked my hands away so fast I nearly knocked over the candles. I wasn't playing anymore. I wasn't pushing it. Something else was. And whatever it wasn't friendly. That's when I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it came from right next to my ear. It was so close that I could feel a cold breath on my neck. The voice was low, like someone trying to talk just below a whisper. I couldn't make out the words at first, but I knew it wasn't in my head. Someone was in the room with me. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuine fear. The kind of fear that makes you question every shadow, every corner, every creak of the floorboards. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then the voice became clearer. Just 2 words. "Get out." I shot up from the couch, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to turn on the lights. When the room lit up, everything looked normal again. No shadows, no figures lurking in the corners, just my crappy apartment with the Ouija board still sitting on the table. But the feeling of dread didn't go away. It was like the walls were closing in on me, like something was watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I grabbed my phone, texting Mark frantically, I didn't care if he thought I was being a weirdo. I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't going crazy. Me. Dude, something's wrong. I think there's something in the apartment. Mark. What? What are you talking about? Me. The board. I think it's real. It's saying things. I heard something whisper. Mark. Stop. Get out of there. I told you not to mess with it. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my jacket, keys and phone and bolted for the door. The moment I stepped into the hallway outside, I felt like I could breathe again. The air felt lighter, warmer, like whatever had been in that room was trapped there, bound to that damn board. I spent the night in my car, parked in a 24-hour diner parking lot. Not the best idea, but I wasn't about to go back to my apartment until I figured out what was going on. I tried to shake the whole thing off, tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore what I'd heard. That whisper, that voice that came from right beside me when I was alone in the room. The next morning, Mark came back from his trip. I hadn't slept, and I was still parked in the diner lot when he called, asking if I was okay. "I'm coming over," he said before I could even explain. When we got back to the apartment, everything looked just the way I left it. Mark was trying to play it cool, but I could tell he was spooked too. He kept glancing around like he expected something to jump out of the shadows. "What exactly happened?" he asked, staring at the Ouija board sitting on the coffee table. I told him everything, about the board, the planchette spelling out tonight, the voice, the cold breath on my neck. Mark's face went pale, and when I finished, he just stood there for a moment, looking at the board like it might move on its own. "We need to get rid of that thing," he said finally, his voice tight. I couldn't agree more. The problem was, I didn't know how. Do you just throw something like that in the trash? Burn it? I had no idea how to properly get rid of a cursed Ouija board, but I wasn't about to Google it either. That's when Mark suggested we take it outside, far away from the apartment, and bury it somewhere. Somewhere it couldn't find its way back. The whole thing sounded ridiculous, but at this point, I was ready to try anything. We wrapped the board in an old blanket, threw it in the trunk of Mark's car, and drove out to this deserted field on the edge of town. It was one of those places nobody goes to anymore, where the grass is overgrown and there's no one around for miles. Perfect for getting rid of something you don't want anyone finding. We dug a hole, deep enough that we wouldn't have to worry about anyone accidentally stumbling on it. The whole time we were out there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, like something was hovering just outside of our line of sight, waiting. Finally, we dropped the board into the ground, covered it up, and drove back to the apartment. The whole thing should have been over, right? But when I got back inside, something felt off again. The candles I had knocked over, they were standing upright now, perfectly placed, like I'd never touched them. And on the coffee table, in the exact spot where the board had been, there was something else. Something I hadn't left there. A single piece of paper. Scrawled across it, in shaky, uneven handwriting, was the same message I'd heard whispered in my ear the night before. "Get out." The sight of that note sitting on my coffee table sent a jolt of panic through me like an electric shock. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, trying to make sense of how it got there. I mean, we buried the board. We were miles away when we did it. There was no way someone followed us, no way they could have known where we went. And yet, here it was, the same message that had whispered in my ear the night before. Get out. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the paper across the room and pretend I'd never seen it. But instead, I just stood there, staring at the words like they might change if I looked hard enough. Mark was behind me, breathing heavily, clearly just as freaked out as I was. "What the hell, man?" he muttered. "How is that even possible?" I had no answer. I couldn't think straight. It felt like reality was bending around me, like the normal rules of life didn't apply anymore. All I knew was that something wasn't right. Something was still connected to me, even after we'd buried the board. Mark, being the more level-headed one, grabbed the note from my hands and crumpled it up. "We need to leave. Now." I couldn't argue with him. My apartment felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. There was this heavy, oppressive silence in the room, the kind that makes your ears ring. Every second we stayed there, I could feel that invisible presence growing stronger, like it was feeding off our fear. We grabbed what we could, our phones, wallets, and a few essentials, before bolting out the door. I didn't care where we were going, I just needed to get out. The moment we stepped into the hallway, the air felt lighter, like whatever had been pressing down on us inside the apartment had let up. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Mark suggested we crash at his parents' place for the night. They lived about an hour away, far enough that I felt like we could escape whatever this was. I didn't want to sleep in my car again, and Mark's parents were cool, so I agreed. At least I wouldn't be alone. We made the drive in near silence, both of us too freaked out to talk. Every now and then, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. But it was just us, speeding down empty roads under a black sky. The further we got from my apartment, the calmer I started to feel. Maybe this was all in my head. Maybe once we left, everything would go back to normal. We pulled into Mark's parents' driveway a little after midnight. Their house sat at the edge of a forest, quiet and isolated, which I figured was a good thing, far away from anything that could follow us. Mark's mom greeted us at the door, concerned but too tired to ask too many questions. We made up some excuse about a power outage at my apartment, which seemed to satisfy her. Mark's dad was already asleep, and honestly, we were both grateful for the quiet. Mark set up the couch for me in the living room while he took the guest bedroom. I tried to settle in, telling myself that this was just a weird, overblown coincidence. I mean, people have freaky experiences all the time with Ouija boards, right? It didn't mean I was cursed. It didn't mean something was actually out to get me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't ignore the feeling that had been creeping up on me all night. The sense that we weren't alone, that something had followed us even here. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, that I was overthinking everything. Until I woke up at 3:33 a.m. I don't remember falling asleep. One second I was lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and the next, my eyes snapped open. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It was freezing, colder than it had any right to be inside a house. I sat up, rubbing my arms, trying to shake off the chill, but it wasn't just cold air. It was the kind of cold that creeps into your bones, that makes you feel like no amount of blankets will ever warm you up. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside the living room. They weren't heavy, but they had a strange, shuffling quality to them, like whoever, or whatever, was walking was dragging their feet. I froze, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call out for Mark, but something stopped me. Some instinct told me not to make a sound. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them entering the living room now, the floorboards creaking under their weight. I tried to convince myself it was Mark, or maybe his dad getting up for a glass of water, but deep down, I knew better. The figure stepped into the dim light coming from the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't his dad. It wasn't human. I don't even know how to describe it without sounding insane, but I'll try. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was a sickly, pale grey, stretched tight over its bones like it was starving. But the worst part, the face. Its face was a twisted, grotesque mockery of a human face, like someone had taken pieces from a dozen different people and stitched them together in the dark. Its mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that split its face almost in half, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. And its eyes, black, empty pits that stared straight through me. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. The thing just stood there, staring at me with that horrible grin, like it was waiting for me to do something. My body was frozen, my muscles stiff with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then, slowly, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed directly at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me sitting there paralyzed with fear, and that thing standing in the doorway, grinning at me with its empty eyes. But eventually, the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway broke the spell. Real, human footsteps. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face pale and confused. "Ryan, what are you doing?" The thing was gone. Just like that, it disappeared. I don't know how, but the moment Mark entered the room, it was like it had never been there. The air was warmer again, the cold gone. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, shaking, staring at the spot where it had been. Mark walked over, looking concerned. "What's wrong, dude? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't explain it to him. I couldn't tell him what I'd just seen. Because even as I sat there, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. It felt real, too real. But maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. Maybe the stress from the board, from the note, from everything had finally gotten to me. Or maybe it was something else. Something worse. I don't remember what I said to Mark that night. Something about a nightmare, I think. But I didn't sleep again after that. I just sat there, staring at the dark corners of the room, waiting for that thing to come back. But it didn't. At least, not that night. I barely made it through the night after that thing appeared. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump. I was half expecting that twisted figure to reappear at any moment, grinning at me from the shadows. But it never did. By the time morning rolled around, I was running on pure adrenaline. I hadn't slept, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. Mark woke up early and found me sitting in the living room, still staring at the same spot where I'd seen that creature. He could tell something was seriously wrong. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" he asked, concern written all over his face. I shook my head, trying to act like I was okay, but I knew he didn't buy it. "We need to go back to the apartment," I said, my voice hoarse. "I can't leave things like this. I need to figure out what's going on." Mark wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but he agreed. Maybe he thought if we confronted whatever this was, head on, it would stop. I didn't know what I was thinking, to be honest. All I knew was that something had followed me, and running away wasn't going to make it stop. The drive back to my apartment was tense. Neither of us said much. Mark kept glancing at me, probably wondering if I was losing it. And maybe I was. The whole way, I kept seeing things in the corner of my eye. Shapes moving in the trees, shadows that weren't supposed to be there. Every time I looked directly at them, they were gone, but the feeling lingered, like I was being watched. When we finally pulled up to my apartment complex, I hesitated before getting out of the car. The building looked normal enough, just like it always did, but something felt different, like it was tainted, as if whatever I'd let in was waiting for me inside. Mark followed me up the stairs, both of us quiet. When I unlocked the door, I half expected something to be standing on the other side, but the apartment was just as we'd left it. Quiet, still, and off. That's the only way I can describe it. The air felt heavy again, like it was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "I don't like this," Mark muttered, his voice low. "There's something wrong here, man. I can feel it." I nodded. I felt it too. We stepped inside, moving cautiously, like we were walking into a trap. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had this gut feeling that something was waiting for us. The apartment looked the same, but it felt wrong. The shadows seemed darker, the corners of the room deeper, like they could swallow you whole if you got too close. I noticed the candles I had used during the Ouija session were still there, standing upright on the coffee table, just like I'd found them after we buried the board. That was impossible. I hadn't touched them since the night before. And then, on the coffee table, in the exact spot where the board had been, was another note. This time, it was folded neatly. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Mark was watching me closely, not saying a word, but I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was. I unfolded the note and felt my heart drop. It knows your name. The words were written in the same shaky, uneven handwriting as before. But this time, they weren't a warning. They were a statement. A fact. I dropped the paper, my breath catching in my throat. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It knows my name." Mark's eyes widened, but he kept his cool. "We need to leave, right now." Before I could respond, something caught my attention. It was faint at first, but growing louder by the second. A sound coming from the hallway. A scratching, like nails dragging across the floor. It was coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to look at Mark, who had gone completely still. His eyes were wide, fixed on the hallway. Neither of us moved. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. Whatever it was coming toward us. And then, out of the silence, I heard it. My name. It was whispered, soft but clear, like someone standing right behind me. "Ryan." I whipped around, expecting to see someone, or something, but there was nothing there. Just the empty apartment, suffocating us with its silence. The scratching stopped. "I'm not staying here," Mark muttered, his voice shaking now. "We're getting out of here." I was too stunned to argue. We grabbed our stuff and bolted for the door. But just as we reached the hallway, I heard it again. Louder this time. "Ryan." It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice. Deep, distorted, echoing in the walls. I could feel it crawling under my skin, making my entire body tense. Mark heard it too. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We ran down the stairs and out of the building, not stopping until we were in the car, doors locked. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. Mark kept looking back at the building, like he expected something to come chasing after us. Finally, I got the car started, and we sped out of the parking lot. Neither of us said a word. We just drove, not knowing where we were going, as long as it was far away from that apartment. Eventually, we ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The place was run down, with flickering neon lights and a receptionist who barely looked up from her phone as we checked in. But it didn't matter. We just needed somewhere to crash for the night, somewhere that wasn't my apartment. We holed up in the room, locking the door behind us, both of us too shaken to talk. I tried to process what had happened, but it didn't make sense. How did it know my name? How could it follow me like this? And why was it targeting me? The night dragged on, and the motel room felt as heavy as my apartment had. I could feel it, whatever it was, still watching me. I knew it was there, just waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. At some point, Mark fell asleep, but I stayed awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. And then, around 3 a.m., the knocking started. It was soft at first, 3 gentle knocks on the motel room door. I thought I imagined it at first, but then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. My heart raced. I didn't want to open the door, didn't want to see who or what was on the other side, but the knocking wouldn't stop. Mark was still asleep, oblivious. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, and walked toward the door. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like it knew I had no choice but to answer. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew that whatever was on the other side wasn't going to be anything I wanted to see. But I had to know. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and opened the door. There was no one there. But on the ground, lying in front of the door, was something I recognized immediately. Wrapped in the same tattered cloth as before, the Ouija board, and scrawled across it, in that same horrible, uneven handwriting, were 2 words. You're next. I slammed the motel door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The Ouija board was back. How? We buried it, left it miles away, and yet here it was, sitting outside the door like it had never left me. I stood there, breathless, staring at the door, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to wake Mark up, but I was frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. The words on the board, "You're next," echoed in my mind, sending a cold shiver down my spine. It was toying with me, playing some sick game. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't over until it decided it was over. I backed away from the door slowly, my legs weak and shaky, and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. Mark stirred in his sleep, completely unaware of what was happening. I didn't know what to do anymore. Running wasn't helping. No matter where I went, this thing followed. I felt trapped, like I was being hunted. For the next hour, I sat there in silence, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to even move. Every creak of the old motel walls made me jump. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open and that thing to come inside. But nothing happened, just an unbearable, suffocating silence. Around 4 a.m., Mark finally woke up. I must have looked like a mess, because the second he saw me, he sat up and asked, "What's going on? You look like hell." I didn't even know where to start. "It's back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark frowned, confused. "What's back?" "The board," I whispered. "It's outside." He didn't believe me at first. Who would? But I dragged him to the door, showed him the Ouija board lying there like a nightmare made real. He stared at it, his face going pale. And then, for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "How?" he started, but his voice trailed off. He didn't have an answer any more than I did. "We have to end this," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "How?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "We buried it, man. We tried to get rid of it. What else can we do?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew we couldn't just leave it there. The board was connected to something that wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. I didn't know what that was, but it was becoming clearer by the minute. I was part of the game now, and it wouldn't end until the final move was made. I grabbed the board and threw it in the trunk of the car, not caring if it followed us again. We needed to do something drastic, something final. Mark suggested we head to the lake a few towns over. If we couldn't bury it, maybe we could drown it, sink it in the deepest part of the water and hope it stayed down. It sounded insane, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. We drove in silence, the darkness of the early morning making the whole world feel eerily still. The sun hadn't come up yet, and everything felt wrong, like time itself had stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following us in the shadows. When we finally reached the lake, it was nearly dawn. The sky was just starting to lighten, casting an eerie glow over the water. We parked the car and hauled the board out of the trunk. The planchette had somehow reappeared with it, resting on the board like it had never been separated. Without saying a word, we walked to the edge of the dock, the wooden planks creaking beneath our feet. The lake was quiet, too quiet. The surface of the water was completely still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the pale light of the rising sun. I could see my reflection in it, pale and gaunt, like I hadn't slept in days. And maybe I hadn't. I couldn't even keep track of time anymore. "This has to work," I whispered, more to myself than to Mark. He nodded, but I could tell he was just as scared as I was. Together we hurled the board into the water. It hit the surface with a loud splash and began to sink, slowly disappearing into the dark, murky depths. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, like maybe, just maybe, we'd finally gotten rid of it. But then, the water started to ripple. At first it was subtle, just small waves, like something stirring beneath the surface. But then the ripples grew larger, more violent, like something massive was thrashing around deep below. The calm lake was suddenly churning, the water frothing and bubbling as if it was boiling. I backed away from the edge of the dock, my heart racing. "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. Before Mark could answer, the water exploded. Something came out of the lake, a dark, twisted figure towering over us, its grotesque limbs dripping with water and sludge. Its face, oh God, its face, was the same horrible, distorted grin I had seen before. But this time, it was clearer, more real, and its eyes, empty black holes that seemed to swallow all the light around them, were locked onto me. It knew my name. It knew me. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me, as the thing began to move toward me. It didn't walk. It glided across the dock, its long arms reaching out toward me, its grin widening. I could hear it whispering again, my name, over and over, in that same deep, distorted voice. Ryan. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as it loomed over me, its face inches from mine. The stench of rot filled the air, choking me. It raised one bony finger and pointed at me, just like it had in the apartment. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was claiming me. Suddenly, Mark screamed. I didn't see what happened. Everything was a blur, but I heard him. I heard his scream cut short, followed by the sound of something splashing into the water. I turned, but Mark was gone. The lake was still churning, violent waves crashing against the dock, but he wasn't there. He had just disappeared. And then, as quickly as it had started, the water stilled. The figure was gone. The lake was calm again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Mark was gone. The board was gone. And I was alone. I don't know how long I sat there on the dock, staring at the lake, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The sun rose, casting a pale light over the water, and I just sat there. I never saw Mark again. I never saw the board again, but I know it's not over, because every night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I hear it, that same voice, that same whisper, calling my name. And one night, I know it'll come back for me. I know I'm next. The Ouija board gave us a name. I found their grave in my backyard. Okay, I know how this is going to sound, but hear me out. This all started because of a stupid joke between friends, something that should have been harmless fun. But now I'm not sure what's real anymore. It's like this dark cloud is hanging over my house, over everything, and I can't shake the feeling that something's watching me. It was a Friday night, and my girlfriend Sarah suggested we have a game night with a couple of friends. Nothing too crazy, just pizza, some drinks, and the usual, cards, board games, stuff like that. We weren't expecting anything paranormal, you know. That's not really our vibe. But then, Tyler, the king of dumb ideas, shows up with a dusty old Ouija board he found at some garage sale. Now, I've always thought those things were just for show, like they're sold at toy stores for a reason, right? It's all fake. But Tyler, he's got this weird fascination with the paranormal. You know the type. He's the guy who's always watching ghost hunting shows and talking about how energy never dies. So when he pulled out the board, he had that look in his eyes, like he was about to show us something life-changing. I should have just said no. But of course, Sarah was curious, and honestly, I didn't want to be the buzzkill. It was just a game after all. We set up the board on the coffee table, dimmed the lights, for atmosphere, Tyler insisted, and we all placed our fingers on the planchette. I remember laughing as Sarah jokingly asked, "Is anyone there?" For a few minutes, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move, and Tyler was getting all frustrated, saying we needed to focus. Right, like that was going to make the spirits care. But then, And I swear I'm not making this up, the planchette started moving. Slowly at first, then with more confidence. None of us admitted to pushing it, but I figured it was just one of us playing along. Maybe Tyler being extra weird. Sarah and I exchanged a glance that basically said, "Okay, this is dumb," but we went along with it anyway. Then it spelled something out, Larkin. Larkin? Sarah said, squinting at the board. What does that mean? Tyler, of course, jumped on it like he was hosting his own paranormal show. Maybe it's a name. Now here's where it got weird. As soon as he said that, I got this, I don't know, this chill, like I could feel it in my bones, this deep, unsettling cold. Sarah must have felt it too, because she shifted uncomfortably and pulled her sweater tighter. Tyler, oblivious, kept going. He asked the board a bunch of typical questions like, "How did you die? And why are you here?" But the planchette didn't move after that. Not an inch. It was like whatever spirit was supposedly talking to us had just left. We all kind of laughed it off after that, trying to shake off the tension. Eventually, we ditched the board for a round of cards, and by the end of the night, it was pretty much forgotten. Except I couldn't forget it. Something about the name Larkin just stuck with me. I know how it sounds, but it felt like it had weight to it. Like it was pulling at the edges of my mind even after everyone had left and the night was over. The next day, I woke up feeling off. Sarah had gone to visit her mum for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. I was doing some yard work, just trying to distract myself, I guess, when I noticed something weird in the backyard. There's this old oak tree that's been there forever, right at the far corner of the yard, where the ground dips a little. Nothing unusual about it, except I noticed the ground near the base of the tree looked disturbed, like freshly disturbed. I know my yard like the back of my hand. I mow it, rake it, even weed it religiously. That patch of ground. It wasn't like that before. It looked like something had been dug up or buried. Now, any sane person would have just shrugged it off, right? Maybe an animal digging around, or maybe I just never noticed it before. But with the name Larkin still in my head, I couldn't let it go. I grabbed a shovel. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but what I found, well, it wasn't what I was prepared for. About 2 feet down, I hit something solid. My heart started racing, and for a second, I thought about just covering it back up and forgetting I ever saw anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I cleared away more dirt until I could see what it was. It was a box. An old wooden box, buried deep enough that it must have been there for years. Decades, maybe. The wood was rotting and the hinges were rusted, but I managed to pry it open. Inside was a bundle of yellowed paper, tied together with brittle string. And on the top sheet, in faded ink, was one word, Larkin. After finding that box with Larkin written on it, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the papers inside. My brain couldn't process it. How did the name from the Ouija board end up in my backyard, buried under an old oak tree? That's not normal. This wasn't just some creepy coincidence, right? It felt too specific, too deliberate. I wanted to walk away, pretend I hadn't found it, but something kept me glued to the spot. That uneasy feeling from the night before, the chill that had settled in my bones, was back. Only now it felt sharper, like I was being watched. The air was still, but everything around me felt wrong. The wind in the trees seemed to hush, and even the birds stopped chirping. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I finally exhaled and started untying the string around the bundle of papers. They were old, and the pages were brittle, like they'd been sitting there for decades. The writing was faded, barely legible in some places, but I could still make out a few sentences here and there. The first page looked like some kind of letter. It was addressed to someone named Mr. Larkin, but there was no date, no return address, just a short, eerie message that read, We told you not to continue. You will pay the price for ignoring us. She is lost because of you. I swear, as I read those words, the temperature dropped around me. I could feel it, like this cold, heavy presence pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. I'm not usually one to freak out over stuff like this, but something about that letter made my skin crawl. It felt like a warning, a threat, like whoever wrote it had meant every word. I flipped through the rest of the papers, my hands shaking. There were more letters, all just as cryptic, some in better condition than others. One of them mentioned something about unfinished business and a debt that could never be paid. But the one that really got me, the one that still haunts me now, was a short note scribbled on the back of a torn piece of paper. It said, "She's under the tree. I'm sorry." I dropped the papers like they'd burned me. I knew it was just a sentence, but in that moment, it felt like the words had weight, like they carried the heaviness of something far worse than I could understand. And what did it mean? She's under the tree. Was someone buried there? Was the box just a hint of something more? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was this some kind of sick prank? Maybe Tyler had planted it. But how? He didn't have time. And he wasn't the type to do something this elaborate. Besides, no one knew the name Larkin before the Ouija board, not even him. That's when I heard it. A knock at the door. Not a casual knock. Not the friendly knock of a neighbour dropping by. This was slow, deliberate, and heavy. 3 knocks, each one louder than the last, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side, knew I was inside, and wanted to make sure I heard them. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. Sarah was still out of town, and I wasn't exactly the type to get random visitors. My house is pretty secluded, just a small place on the outskirts of town, where it's mostly quiet. Too quiet. The knocking continued. 3 more knocks, louder this time, echoing through the house. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt that same creeping coldness settle around me again. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but the words stuck in my throat. I don't know why, but every instinct I had was screaming not to open that door. I grabbed my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I wasn't even sure who I was going to call. Tyler? The police? What would I even tell them? That someone was knocking on my door and I was scared because I found a creepy box with some old letters. They'd laugh me off the line. The knocking stopped. I stood there, still clutching the phone, staring at the door like it might fly open any second. There was no shadow under the crack, no sign that anyone was there, but I wasn't about to go check. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. It was like the entire place was holding its breath. Then I heard it. Not from the door this time, but from the backyard. The unmistakable sound of something moving, shuffling, right where I had been digging earlier. Right where the tree was. I swallowed hard, slowly walking toward the back window. I had to see. I had to know if someone, or something, was out there. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe a deer or some stray animal, but what I saw nearly made my heart stop. The disturbed patch of ground where I had been digging. It was deeper, like someone, or something, had continued digging while I was inside. The hole was wider now, and the dirt around it was scattered, like someone had been frantically trying to unearth whatever was buried there. But there was no one there. No footprints. Nothing. Just the wind swaying the branches of the old oak tree. And then, the knocking started again. Only this time, it was coming from inside the house. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could someone be inside? I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anything except those knocks. But there it was again, 3 heavy knocks, this time coming from the basement door. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear. Long enough for the knocking to stop, for the house to go quiet again. But that's when I realized something chilling. The basement door was always locked. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the basement door. Every instinct I had told me to leave, to just get out of the house, but I couldn't move. The air was thick, like it was pressing down on me, and that cold, no, freezing feeling was creeping up my spine again. The knocking had stopped, but something about the silence felt worse, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. The basement door wasn't just any door in my house. I never used the basement. The lock on it had been broken since I moved in, and the previous owner told me it was just storage space, nothing worth bothering with. I hadn't even tried to open it in years. The key had been lost long ago, and honestly, the idea of going down there had never really appealed to me. I'm not a fan of dark, cramped spaces, but now it felt like whatever was behind that door wanted me to come down, or worse, it was already up here with me. I kept thinking about the knocking, how it had started at the front door and somehow moved to the basement. That doesn't just happen. It wasn't like someone walked across the house and knocked on a different door. No footsteps, no creaks on the floorboards. Just silence, and then knocking. That's when it hit me. What if it wasn't someone knocking? What if it was something trying to get out? I took a few shaky steps closer to the door, straining to hear anything on the other side. For a second, I thought I heard something. A faint whisper. No, it was more like breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, coming from just behind the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I swear, it felt like the whole house was leaning in, listening with me. Then I heard it. A voice. It was low, barely more than a whisper, but I knew it was real. It wasn't in my head. Someone, or something, was down there. Help! Me! Those two words sent a jolt of terror through me. The voice sounded broken, strained, like whoever was speaking had been screaming for days and was finally running out of breath. I don't know why, but it didn't feel like a plea for help. It felt wrong, like the words were being forced, pushed out through gritted teeth. Help. Me. It said it again, and this time the voice was clearer, louder. It wasn't coming from deep in the basement anymore. It was right behind the door. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was this real? Was there really someone down there? But how? The basement was locked, and no one had been in there for years. And even if they had been, how could they survive without food, water, or, well, anything? Please, help me. I froze. This time the voice wasn't asking. It was commanding. It was like whoever or whatever was down there was getting impatient, as if it knew I was hesitating, knew I could hear it and was ignoring it. I couldn't explain it, but that voice, it sounded familiar. Not in a comforting way, but like a memory I couldn't quite place. It felt like I'd heard it before, in a dream or maybe a nightmare, and it was crawling its way back into my mind, demanding to be recognized. Before I could stop myself, my hand reached for the doorknob. I don't even remember doing it, but there I was, my fingers grazing the cold metal. It felt wrong, like the air around the door was colder than the rest of the house. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to back away and leave the house, but something about the voice, it pulled at me. It was desperate. It needed me. I don't know how long I stood there, torn between opening the door and running as far as I could. The house was so quiet, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my own breathing sounding loud and out of place. And then, just as my hand gripped the knob, something stopped me. The basement door creaked. Not from me moving it. It moved on its own. The door opened just a crack, no more than an inch, but it was enough for me to see the darkness beyond it. That's when the smell hit me. It was damp, musty, like old wood rotting in a forgotten corner of the earth. But underneath that, there was something else, something sour, like spoiled food, or death. I gagged, pulling my hand back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that narrow crack in the earth. And then, just when I thought nothing could get worse, something moved in the darkness. It was subtle at first, like a shadow shifting, but then I saw it clearly. Fingers, pale, bony fingers creeping through the crack in the door, curling around the edge, pulling the door open wider. They were too thin, too long, like they belonged to something that hadn't seen the light in years. The nails were broken and jagged, caked with dirt. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. My eyes were locked on the door as it slowly opened wider, revealing more of the darkness inside. And then, I saw it. A face. Pale, sunken eyes stared back at me from the shadows, hollow and dead, but somehow still aware. The skin was stretched tight over the skull, and the mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural way, like it was trying to scream but couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare, as that thing, whatever it was, pushed the door open wider with those horrible, clawed hands. It leaned forward, just enough for the dim light to catch its face. And then, in that same broken, raspy voice, it whispered, "Help. Me." I don't know how I did it, but I snapped out of it. Something in my brain finally kicked in, and I scrambled to my feet, turning and bolting for the front door. My vision was swimming, my heart felt like it was about to explode, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me as I ran out into the yard, my feet barely touching the ground. When I finally stopped running, I realized I was standing by the oak tree, the same one where I'd dug up that box. The hole was still there, and for a second, I thought about grabbing a shovel, about trying to bury whatever was in that basement for good. But then, I heard it again, the voice. Only now it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the hole. "Help me." The voice was clearer now, less strained, but it wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from under the tree, from deep in the ground. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air, my head spinning. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Whatever was in my house, whatever was under that tree, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could help. And now, I don't think it wants help at all. I don't know what to do. I can't go back there. Not alone. Not until I figure out what the hell is going on. If anyone's dealt with something like this before, I need answers. Because right now, I'm terrified to find out what that thing really is. And worse, I think it's not finished with me yet. I didn't go back to the house that night. I couldn't. Instead, I crashed at Tyler's place. I didn't tell him everything, just that I was feeling creeped out and needed a place to stay. He didn't ask too many questions, which was a relief. We spent the night watching dumb movies, and for a few hours, I almost convinced myself that what happened at my place was just some wild hallucination, brought on by stress or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something real lurking in my house, under my yard. The next morning, Tyler headed to work, leaving me alone with my thoughts. My mind kept circling back to the name. Larkin. Who was Larkin? And why had they been calling to me through that Ouija board? Why was their name in those letters buried beneath the tree? I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to figure out what was going on. If I didn't, that thing, whatever it was, would keep finding me. I could feel it, like a shadow creeping closer, waiting for me to slip up. So, I decided to do what anyone would do when they're desperate for answers. I turned to the internet. I started with a basic search. Larkin and death. At first, it was just pages of irrelevant stuff. But then I stumbled upon a local history forum, and that's when things took a dark turn. Buried in a thread about unsolved crimes from the 1940s, there it was. James Larkin. My stomach dropped when I saw the name. According to the post, James Larkin had been a local historian, obsessed with occult studies and the paranormal. He'd lived in my town, in the exact area where my house stands today. In the late 1940s, Larkin's wife, Evelyn, went missing under mysterious circumstances. The town was small back then, not much law enforcement to speak of, so when Evelyn disappeared, it was written off as a tragic accident. People assumed she wandered off and fell into the river or got lost in the woods. There was never a body. But the rumors were much darker. Some people believed James had something to do with her disappearance, that he'd gotten too deep into his occult studies, messing with things he didn't understand. Some even claimed he had summoned something evil, and that whatever he called had taken Evelyn. The kicker? James Larkin vanished a year later, just disappeared one night without a trace, leaving behind his house and everything in it. And here's where it gets even weirder. After he vanished, the house sat empty for years. No one would buy it, not even for dirt cheap. Eventually, it was torn down in the 60s, and a new house was built in its place. My house. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room when I read that. My head started spinning. I stood up, pacing back and forth in Tyler's apartment, trying to wrap my head around it all. I live in the house that was built over the land where James Larkin lived, and possibly did something terrible. That's when my phone buzzed. It was Sarah, finally back in town. She texted me to say she was headed to my place to grab some of her things, and my blood ran cold. I'd forgotten to warn her. I'd left in such a panic the night before that I didn't even think to tell her not to go there. I called her immediately, heart racing, praying she hadn't already gone inside. She picked up after a few rings, her voice cheerful. "Hey, I'm just grabbing my stuff. What's up?" "Sarah, don't go in the house," I said, probably too loudly. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Why? What's going on?" I didn't want to scare her, but I didn't have time to sugarcoat it. Just, something's wrong with the house. I don't know how to explain it, but please, just wait for me. Don't go inside. She hesitated. "I'm already in the living room. Everything seems fine to me." My heart dropped. "Sarah, get out of there. Please." Another pause. "Okay, I'll wait for you outside." I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of Tyler's place, driving as fast as I could back to my house. My hands were trembling the whole way there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching Sarah, something waiting for me to return. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see her standing outside by the front door, her arms crossed. She waved, but there was a strange look on her face, like she wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but she was definitely creeped out. I parked and practically ran up to her. "What the hell is going on, man?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could say a word, something happened that made my blood freeze. The front door. It creaked open on its own. We both stood there, staring at it. Neither of us moved or spoke for what felt like an eternity. The house was completely still. No wind, no noise from inside. Just that door, open slightly, like it was inviting us in. "I didn't open it," Sarah whispered. I swallowed hard. "We need to leave." But just as we turned to head back to the car, there was a sound. A voice, low and raspy, coming from inside the house. It said one word, my name. "Come back." The voice was slow, deliberate. It stretched out each syllable like it was savoring the sound of my name. I felt my skin crawl. I didn't recognize the voice, but at the same time, I did. It was the same one I'd heard in the basement, the one that had whispered, "Help me." But now it wasn't asking for help. It was calling me by name. Sarah's eyes were wide. She grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the car, and for a second I let her. But then I stopped. I don't know what came over me, but I had to know. I had to see it, whatever was in my house, whatever was calling me. "Wait," I said, pulling away from her. "I need to know what it is." She stared at me like I was insane, and maybe I was. Maybe I still am. but something inside me, maybe the same thing that had driven me to dig under that tree, was pushing me to go back in, to face whatever was waiting for me inside. "Are you serious?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I can't leave it like this," I said, stepping toward the open door. "Just wait here. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, call someone." I didn't give her a chance to argue. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding in my ears, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. No creaks, no groans of the old wood, not even the sound of the wind outside. It was like stepping into a vacuum. Everything felt off. The air was heavy, thick, like the very house was breathing around me. I took a few steps into the living room, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the far end of the room, near the basement door, was a figure. It was tall, hunched, its skin pale and stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural smile. It wasn't human, and it was waiting for me. "Come back," it whispered again, and this time I knew. I knew who it was. It was James Larkin, or at least what was left of him. My whole body locked up. The thing standing in my living room, I knew it wasn't just some hallucination. This was James Larkin, or at least something wearing his skin, something that had been waiting for years for someone to open that door. I could feel its eyes, those hollow black pits, boring into me, even though they weren't really eyes at all. They were empty, endless, and I had the sickening feeling that if I stared into them too long, I'd lose myself in them, forever. "Come back," it whispered again, in that same twisted voice, and with each word its mouth stretched wider, too wide. The skin around its lips cracked and split as the smile grew, revealing teeth, long, sharp, and wrong. It wasn't smiling out of joy. This thing was hungry. I took a step back, my heart hammering so hard I thought my chest would burst. I should have run, should have bolted out the front door and never looked back. But something held me in place. Something deep inside me whispered, "This isn't over. You need to finish this." The letters, the box, the name. It all came crashing back to me. Larkin had been calling to me, through the board, through the house, through that cursed tree, and I had answered. I could hear Sarah outside, calling my name, her voice filled with panic. I wanted to tell her to leave, to get as far away from here as possible, but my throat was dry, and my body wouldn't respond. The only thing I could do was stare at the thing standing across from me. Its head tilted, that wide, grotesque grin never faltering. Then slowly, it lifted one of its long, bony fingers and pointed, not at me, but at the floor, the basement door. My stomach turned. I knew what it wanted. It didn't just want me to see it. It wanted me to follow it down there. It wanted me to go into the basement. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But even as I said it, I could feel my feet moving toward the door. The air was thick with something oppressive, something ancient and malevolent, and it was pulling me toward that basement like a puppet on strings. The door creaked open, wider this time, revealing the stairs that descended into the dark. That horrible smell, like rot and damp earth, wafted up from below, and I gagged, covering my mouth. But still I moved forward. The thing behind me, Larkin or whatever was left of him, followed silently, its breath like a cold breeze on the back of my neck. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the blackness. The dim light from the living room barely touched the first few steps, but I could make out something at the bottom. A shape, hunched and unmoving. I didn't want to go down there. Every fibre of my being screamed for me to stop. But the air seemed to thicken around me, forcing me to take that first step. Then the second. Each creak of the stairs beneath me felt like a countdown, ticking towards something awful. Halfway down, I heard it. A voice, but not Larkin's voice. This one was soft, distant, and trembling with fear. A woman's voice. "Please, help me." My blood turned to ice. The letters, the one that said, "She's under the tree. I'm sorry." It all clicked into place. Evelyn Larkin, the woman who had disappeared, the one no one had ever found. She wasn't lost in the woods or the river. She was here, in my basement. I reached the bottom step, my legs trembling so badly I thought they'd give out. The smell was overwhelming now. Decay, mold, and something far worse. I could barely see in the dim light, but I could make out a shape in the corner of the basement. It was a mound of earth, the dirt disturbed, like it had been dug up and filled in again, over and over. And then I saw her, a figure crouched beside the mound, a woman, her hair matted and filthy, her skin pale and paper-thin. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, torn and stained. Her hands clawed at the dirt, weakly digging, as if she had been trying to escape for years and had finally given up. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. It was Evelyn, or whatever was left of her. I'm sorry," she whispered, barely more than a breath. He wouldn't let me go. Behind me, I heard the creak of floorboards, the slow, deliberate footsteps of something that had been waiting for this moment. I turned, and there he was, Larkin, standing at the top of the stairs, his twisted form hunched over, watching us both with that horrible grin. "It's not my fault," Evelyn sobbed, her voice cracking with years of despair. "He wouldn't let me go. He needs another." My mind raced. Another? What was she talking about? Then Larkin's voice echoed from the top of the stairs. The debt must be paid. I finally understood. Larkin had summoned something terrible, back in the 1940s, and it had taken Evelyn as payment. But it wasn't enough. It needed more. And Larkin, twisted by whatever dark force he had unleashed, had been feeding it ever since. And now it was my turn. The basement door slammed shut behind him, and the air grew impossibly cold. I could feel it closing in, that thing, whatever he had bound himself to, hungry, waiting. I had opened the box, I had dug up the past, and now I was the one it wanted. "No," I said, backing away toward the stairs. "I won't do it, I won't..." But before I could finish, the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled backward into the dirt. The earth was loose, soft, like something had been buried there recently, or was waiting to be. Evelyn let out a low, broken sob as the dirt began to pull me down, like quicksand, dragging me toward the mound. Larkin watched from the top of the stairs, his grin widening, his hollow eyes locked on me as the dirt swallowed my legs, pulling me deeper. I screamed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The earth was pulling me under, just like it had pulled Evelyn. This was how it ended. This was how it took you. Buried alive, another soul to satisfy whatever Larkin had brought into this world. But then, just as the dirt reached my chest, I heard a sound that snapped me out of my panic. Sarah. She was banging on the basement door, shouting my name, her voice frantic. "I called the cops. They're on their way. Hold on." The thing, Larkin, snarled, his smile twisting into a grotesque scowl as he turned toward the door. I saw my chance. With everything I had, I pulled myself up, fighting against the earth, scrambling toward the stairs. My hands found the railing, and I hauled myself up, the dirt pulling at my feet, but I didn't stop. I don't know how, but I made it to the top. I threw myself at the basement door, banging on it with both fists. It flew open, and Sarah grabbed me, pulling me out of the house as fast as she could. We didn't stop running until we were outside, under the pale morning light. I collapsed on the lawn, gasping for air, my hands trembling, my whole body coated in dirt. The front door slammed shut behind us. I looked back at the house, at the windows that seemed to glare back at me, and I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was inside that house, whatever Larkin had unleashed, was still there, and it wasn't finished, not by a long shot. We heard the sirens in the distance. Sarah knelt beside me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm calling a realtor," she said, her voice shaking. "We're getting the hell out of here." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. You can leave a house, but some things, once they find you, never let go. The Ouija board warned me not to leave my house. I wish I'd listened. Alright, so I'm not the kind of person who usually believes in paranormal stuff. Ghosts, demons, curses. Nah, I always figured it was all just Hollywood material. But this really messed me up, and honestly, I don't even know where to start. So, let me back up and just tell you the whole thing. Beginning with my colossal mistake. Messing around on the deep web. I'm a night owl, and after endless nights of scrolling through Reddit and watching late-night YouTube videos, I started getting bored. One night, I was on a video binge, watching conspiracy theories and deep web horror stories. You know the type. Ghost hunting videos, creepy found footage that's obviously fake, but kind of fun. After hours of that, I started wondering, how much of this stuff could actually be real? Is the deep web as dangerous as people say, or is it just another exaggeration? You can probably guess where this is going. I wasn't tech savvy enough to do any serious digging, but I knew enough to use Tor. I'm not proud of it, but curiosity got the best of me. I dove in, clicking through shady links and random forums, half expecting to stumble across some hacker trying to sell me credit card info or, I don't know, black market fireworks or something. Instead, I found something much weirder. It was a simple, nameless page with just a question in plain white text. Do you want to know your fate? Underneath that, there was only one clickable link, titled Ouija bot. I laughed at how absurd it sounded. An online Ouija board? Come on. I knew this had to be some dumb prank, but the boredom was real, and part of me thought, why not? It's just a game, right? A few clicks, I'd get some spooky automated response, maybe a few jump scares, and that'd be it. I clicked the link, and a very basic chat window opened up. No flashy graphics or creepy noises, just a black background and a single message. Ask your question. I thought for a second, feeling dumb even typing out the words, will anything bad happen to me soon? A moment passed, and then the board responded, yes. I rolled my eyes. Obviously, it was programmed to freak people out. So, I asked another question. What should I avoid? This time, the answer took a little longer. It came back with something that made me pause for a second. Do not leave your house. Now, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that response gave me a weird chill. The deep web's full of creepy stuff, but something about this one-liner felt off. Maybe it was the timing, or the fact that I'd been watching too many creepy videos, but for a second, I actually hesitated. Was it just messing with me? Or was I seriously starting to believe that some random deep web bot was giving me a warning? I shook it off. No way this was real. I had work the next day, and no algorithm was going to spook me into staying home. But then, because I was feeling a little too brave for my own good, I asked one more question. Why shouldn't I leave? This time, the response was instant, and it was just one word. Death. Okay, that's when things got way too real for me. I closed the window, feeling a bit more unnerved than I wanted to admit. It was just a stupid program on the deep web trying to scare me. It didn't mean anything, right? I decided to call it a night. I shut down my computer, climbed into bed, and tried to sleep. But for the rest of the night, I kept replaying that last word in my mind. Death. It stuck with me, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Morning came, and honestly, I felt stupid for even letting that stuff get to me. It was just a prank, some troll's idea of fun. I mean, people do this kind of thing all the time on the internet, right? Still, there was this little itch in the back of my mind. I wasn't scared per se, but more like uneasy. You know when you feel like something's wrong but can't quite put your finger on it. I went through my morning routine like normal, took a shower, made some coffee, checked my phone, but something kept bugging me. What if I did just stay in? No harm in that. I could say I wasn't feeling well and work from home, maybe play it safe, right? But nah, I wasn't going to let some creepy deep web bot get in my head. I grabbed my keys and headed out, ignoring that stupid warning. Big mistake. I should have stayed home. So, I headed out that morning, still shaking off that weird feeling from the Ouija bot the night before. The sky was this dull grey, not unusual for October, but something about it made everything feel heavier. I brushed it off, figuring I was still a little spooked from my late-night deep web adventure. I wasn't going to let a creepy website dictate my life, right? Still, I kept telling myself I'd just grab coffee, hit work, and everything would be fine. The weirdness started almost immediately. As I walked down the street, I noticed it was quieter than usual, like way quieter. Normally my neighborhood's pretty busy in the mornings. People walking their dogs, cars rushing to work, all that regular city stuff. But today, nothing. Not a single car drove by. No one was out for their morning jog, not even a bird chirping. I know it sounds cliché, but the silence was unnatural. It wasn't just that it was quiet. It was like the world had been muted. I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was dead. I could have sworn I charged it overnight. But nope, black screen. Maybe I had a faulty cable or something. Whatever. I just kept walking, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. About halfway to the coffee shop, I passed by this old house at the corner of the street. It's been abandoned for as long as I can remember. Boarded up windows, cracked foundation, the whole haunted house vibe. Normally, I don't pay it much attention. But today, there was something different. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no. There, in one of the second-story windows, was a person. Or at least, I thought it was a person. They were just standing there, perfectly still, staring down at me. They weren't close enough for me to make out their face, but something about the way they stood, rigid, almost unnaturally straight, made my skin crawl. I froze. It was broad daylight, but all of a sudden, I felt this wave of dread wash over me, like I wasn't supposed to see them. I don't know how to explain it, but you know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately sense you're being watched. It was like that, times 1,000. I told myself it was just some squatter, maybe a homeless person who found shelter inside the abandoned house. But my legs started moving a little faster, like on autopilot. I didn't want to run because, you know, I'm an adult, and I wasn't going to let some random shadow freak me out. But I couldn't help it. My heart was pounding. That's when I noticed something else that I couldn't shake. As I sped up, so did the shadow in the window, not moving toward me or anything, but shifting slightly, like it was following me with its gaze. I sped up more, practically power walking at this point, trying to shake that feeling. I kept looking back, convincing myself I was overreacting, but every time I glanced back, they were still there, watching. The air felt colder, like someone had cranked the thermostat down to 0. And the street, still dead quiet, too quiet. When I finally reached the coffee shop, I practically stumbled through the door, grateful for the warmth inside. The bell above the door chimed, and the usual hum of conversation hit me like a wave of normalcy. I almost laughed at myself for being so freaked out. I was ready to chalk it up to my overactive imagination when I saw the barista behind the counter, a girl named Jenna I'd chatted with a few times before. She was usually super friendly, always chatting up customers, but today, she looked pale. I mean, really pale. "Hey, you all right?" I asked as I approached the counter. She didn't say anything for a second, just stared at me like she didn't recognize me, even though I came in almost every morning. Then she spoke, her voice low, like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "You shouldn't be out today." I blinked. "What?" She leaned in, glancing nervously at the door behind me, her hands shaking as she handed me my coffee. I don't know what it is, but something's wrong today. Like, really wrong. People aren't supposed to leave their houses. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind flashed back to the Ouija board. Do not leave your house. I forced a laugh. Wait, what? Why? She didn't laugh with me. I don't know, but people have been acting off all morning. No shows, weird calls. I even saw a guy standing outside for an hour, just staring through the window, like not moving at all. My mouth went dry. I didn't need to ask which guy. I already knew. I grabbed my coffee and mumbled a thanks before turning to leave, trying to shake off the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. But before I could even step out the door, Jenna called after me. Wait! I turned, and her face was even paler than before. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door again. Just be careful, okay? Don't go anywhere else today. My skin prickled. She didn't even wait for a response before she disappeared into the back, leaving me standing there, holding my coffee and wondering what the hell was going on. I stepped outside, and the cold air hit me again, sharper this time. The street was just as empty as before, silent. The house with the figure in the window was still in my peripheral vision, but I didn't dare look up again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whoever, or whatever it was still watching me. Waiting. I started walking back home. Faster this time. The warning from the Ouija board kept playing in my head on a loop, like a broken record. Do not leave your house. Maybe I should have listened. Walking back home, my thoughts were all over the place. Everything that had happened that morning, from the creepy figure in the window to Jenna's weird warning, was starting to pile up. The further I got from the coffee shop, the worse that feeling of being watched became. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that this was just some elaborate prank, or my mind playing tricks after too many late nights. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. It was that gut instinct, the kind you get when you know you're in danger, but can't pinpoint why. The walk home felt different. The air was still heavy and cold, and the strange silence that had swallowed the neighborhood earlier was somehow even thicker. It was like the whole world was on pause, except for me. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of traffic that usually fills the background noise of a city. Just nothing. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The street signs were missing. At first I thought maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. I mean, who pays attention to street signs when you've lived somewhere your whole life, right? But no, they were gone. The poles were still there, sticking out of the ground like toothpicks, but the actual signs had been removed. Just bare, empty poles standing in a row. I hadn't noticed it on the way to the coffee shop, but now that I was looking for them, I realized every single sign was missing. I tried to tell myself it was probably just some construction thing. Maybe the city was replacing the signs or something. Though why they'd take them all down at once, I had no clue. Still, that gut feeling I had was screaming at me. Something was definitely off. I quickened my pace, wanting to get home as fast as possible. Every step felt heavier, like the ground was pulling at me, trying to slow me down. It wasn't fear exactly, more like this overwhelming pressure, the kind that makes you feel like if you don't get inside now, something terrible is going to happen. As I rounded the corner onto my street, my stomach dropped. My house was gone. I don't mean it was demolished or anything. No, the house that had been there just hours ago, the house I had lived in for the past 5 years, wasn't there anymore. In its place was an empty lot. No foundation, no debris, nothing. It was like it had never existed. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe I'd just taken a wrong turn, but no. This was definitely my street. The same row of houses, the same cracked sidewalk. Except now, my house was missing like it had been erased. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might pass out. I pulled out my phone again, desperate to call someone, anyone, but it was still dead. I shoved it back into my pocket, cursing under my breath, and that's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Across the street, standing in the yard of one of the other houses, was a man. At least, I think it was a man. He was tall, dressed in all black, with his head tilted at an awkward angle. He wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still, facing me. I took a step back, my pulse racing. I opened my mouth to shout something, but no words came out. The guy just stood there staring. His head tilted even further, almost like it was going to snap off his neck, but it didn't. It just stayed at that unnatural angle, watching me. I turned and bolted. I didn't care where I was going, just that I needed to get away from whatever this was. The pounding in my ears drowned out everything, my legs burning as I ran down the street. The houses around me blurred as I sprinted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I dared to glance over my shoulder just for a second. There were more of them now. 3 figures, all dressed in black, standing motionless at the edge of the street. Watching. I couldn't make out their faces, but I knew they were staring right at me. Their heads were all tilted at that same sickening angle, like broken dolls left in unnatural positions. I turned back and ran harder. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even think. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, to get away from them. But the street, it just kept going. Longer than it should have. I knew my neighborhood. I knew this street. But it felt like I had been running for miles, and the houses were still stretching on and on, like the road itself was shifting, expanding. The sky was growing darker, even though it was only late morning. I stumbled, nearly falling face first onto the sidewalk, but caught myself just in time. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My house, it was back, right there in front of me, as if it had never disappeared. The front door was wide open, the windows dark and empty, but it didn't feel right. The house looked wrong, like a shadow of itself, too sharp, too still, almost like a photograph, perfectly frozen in time. My feet felt rooted to the spot. I knew, deep down, that going inside was a terrible idea, but there was nowhere else to go. The figures were still behind me, and I couldn't outrun them forever. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me, and forced myself to move toward the front door. The air felt thicker the closer I got, like I was wading through invisible mud. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me in. As I reached the door, I heard a voice, low, barely a whisper, but clear as day. You shouldn't have left. Standing at my front door, if you could even call it my front door anymore, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. The house that had vanished only minutes ago was now right in front of me, but everything about it felt wrong. The door, wide open like it was inviting me in, seemed more like a trap than a refuge. And that whisper, "You shouldn't have left," echoed in my head, even though I had no idea where it had come from. But here's the thing, there wasn't a choice. Whatever those figures were, they were behind me, still watching, still waiting. I could feel them, and as much as I didn't want to step inside that house, I knew going back out on the street was worse. So I crossed the threshold, stepping into what used to be my living room. The moment I did, it felt like the air shifted, heavier, thicker. The light coming through the windows was dim, but not in a natural way. It was like someone had put a dirty film over the glass. The shadows in the corners were too dark, too deep, and they seemed to stretch out toward me, like the house itself was trying to close in on me. I called out, my voice shaky, even though I knew no one else was there. "Hello?" Nothing. Just silence. I stepped further in, the door creaking shut behind me on its own, the sound echoing through the house. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Everything inside looked like it had when I left that morning, but something was off. The furniture was all in the right places, but it seemed faded, like the edges of everything were blurred, just slightly out of focus. Even the air smelled wrong, a faint scent of something sour, like rotting wood. I walked into the kitchen, and that's when I noticed something that nearly stopped me in my tracks. On the table was my coffee cup from this morning, right where I'd left it. But the coffee was still steaming. It couldn't have been, though. Hours had passed, and the coffee should have been stone cold by now. I reached out and touched the cup. Warm. Fresh. That's when I knew. This wasn't my house. Or at least, it wasn't the version of my house that I had left this morning. I felt like I had stepped into some twisted mirror of my own life, where everything looked almost right, but was horribly wrong at the same time. I backed away from the table, my breath coming quicker now. That feeling of being watched hadn't left me. In fact, it was stronger, pressing down on me like a weight. I turned, expecting to see those figures from outside standing in the doorway, but no, the house was empty. Except, I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was pacing back and forth upstairs. I froze, listening. There shouldn't have been anyone in the house. I lived alone. But the footsteps continued, moving from one room to the next, dragging slightly, like whoever it was had something heavy attached to their feet. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and against every ounce of common sense I had left, I started moving toward the stairs. The creaking sound of those footsteps echoed in my ears, and with every step I took, I could feel my fear building, like something terrible was waiting for me at the top of those stairs. I reached the bottom step and hesitated. The air up there felt colder, and the light filtering down from the second floor had that same unnatural tint. My hand gripped the railing, and I felt the wood beneath my fingers. It was wet, sticky. I jerked my hand back, looking down to see a smear of something dark and thick on my palm. Blood. No, it didn't smell like blood. It smelled like something far worse. I wiped my hand on my jeans and forced myself up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, like the house itself was trying to pull me back. The footsteps had stopped now, but I could hear something else, a faint, low humming. It wasn't music exactly, more like the sound of someone humming tunelessly to themselves in the dark. As I reached the top, I saw that the hallway was longer than it should have been. Much longer. It stretched out before me, the door to my bedroom at the far end seeming miles away. I started walking, the humming growing louder with each step. The walls felt closer too, like they were slowly inching toward me, narrowing the hallway. When I finally reached the bedroom door, I hesitated again. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, I seriously considered turning around and running. But where would I go? The house had me now. I could feel it. I opened the door. The room was pitch black. No light from the windows, no glow from the street outside. Just darkness. But I could feel something in there with me. The air was thick, and the low humming had stopped, replaced by shallow breathing. My chest tightened, and I took a shaky step into the room. My hand fumbled for the light switch on the wall, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The darkness stayed, and the breathing got louder, closer. I could barely see, but in the corner of the room, I noticed a shape. Something crouched, just barely visible in the shadows. My blood ran cold. Whatever it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body twisted in a way that defied anatomy. The head was cocked at an unnatural angle, much like the figures I'd seen on the street. It didn't move at first, just sat there, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I took a step back, my whole body screaming at me to run. But then it spoke. Its voice was low, raspy, like it hadn't used its vocal cords in years. "You left the house." I don't know why I responded. I don't know why I didn't just turn and run. But I stood there, frozen, and whispered, What are you?" The thing tilted its head even further, and the sound of its bones cracking made my stomach churn. It crawled forward, moving like a broken spider, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. As it got closer, I could see its face, pale, hollow, with eyes that seemed to reflect the darkness around it. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its twisted smile stretching across its face. "You were warned." Before I could scream, the door behind me slammed shut. The door slammed behind me so hard it shook the walls, the echo rattling in my bones. I spun around, grabbing at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I pounded on it, desperate, but no one was coming to help. Not here, not in this house, and behind me. That thing, the twisted, broken figure, was still crawling closer, its limbs dragging across the floor with a sickening scrape. Its breathing was shallow, wet, like it was gasping for air with lungs that didn't belong to it. My skin crawled. I couldn't see its face clearly anymore, just the faint glint of its hollow eyes reflecting in the dark. But I could feel it staring at me, watching. I pressed my back against the door, my mind racing. I couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. My eyes flicked around the room, desperately searching for anything I could use, a weapon, a way out, anything. But the room was empty. Just a bed, the same furniture that should have been there, but none of it felt real anymore. It was like I had stepped into a warped version of my life, and nothing made sense. And then, the humming came back. It wasn't coming from the creature in front of me. Number this was different. The same low, tuneless humming I had heard before. But this time, it was coming from inside the walls, surrounding me. I felt my pulse quicken as the walls themselves seemed to pulse with it, like the house was alive, breathing along with that awful sound. The figure stopped crawling, now just crouching in the center of the room, staring at me, waiting. It didn't need to move. The house was doing the work for it. The walls began to close in. At first, it was subtle. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. The walls were moving. Slowly, inch by inch, they were drawing closer, like the house was tightening its grip. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. My chest tightened with every breath, panic rising like a wave about to crash over me. I tried the door again, pulling, twisting, kicking. Nothing. It was like the house was sealed. There was no getting out. Not now. Then, from the shadows, I heard it again. That same voice, low, raspy, and far too close. "You never should have left." The words slithered into my ears, chilling me to the core. The creature hadn't moved, but its voice was everywhere, surrounding me. I looked back at it, its head cocked, eyes gleaming with a sick amusement. It didn't need to chase me. It didn't need to drag me down. The house was doing that for it. The walls were closing in faster now. What had once been a spacious room was now barely large enough to stand in. My shoulders were brushing against the walls, the ceiling dropping lower, and the air growing so thin that I felt like I was suffocating. I was trapped, and I knew it. I pressed my back harder against the door, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor, my legs pulled in tight to my chest. The figure, whatever it was still in the center of the room, but it wasn't moving anymore. It just crouched there, grinning, like it knew this was the end, like it had been waiting for this moment. The humming in the walls grew louder, and the room grew darker. The house was swallowing me whole, and the figure. Its voice came again, but this time, it was different. "You tried to leave, but you belong here." The walls were so close now that I could barely move. I could feel the cold press of the house against my skin, the weight of it crushing me. And the creature, that twisted thing in the center of the room, slowly rose to its feet. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever came next. There was no way out. I knew that now. The house didn't let you go once it had you. It warned me, and I didn't listen. The floorboards beneath me creaked, and I felt the vibrations of the creature's footsteps, slow and deliberate. as it moved closer. Its breath was on my neck now, cold and damp, like it was tasting the air around me. I opened my eyes, and there it was, right in front of me. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was inches from mine, pale and hollow, its eyes burning with a darkness that seemed to go on forever. It leaned in close, its voice barely a whisper now. "You can't leave. You're part of the house now." I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, and the air was too thin. I was choking, suffocating under the weight of the house pressing in on me. The darkness swallowed everything, and the last thing I saw before it all went black was the figure's grin stretching wider, impossibly wide, like it was laughing at me. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed. The room was normal again. The walls were where they should be, the ceiling high above me. The light from the windows streamed in, and everything looked just as it had when I left that morning. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a dream. Maybe I had imagined everything, the deep web, the warning, the figures, the house closing in on me. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My phone was on the bedside table, and it was buzzing. Slowly, I reached over and picked it up, my hand trembling. The screen flickered to life, and there was a single message waiting for me. It was from an unknown number. "Do not leave your house." I dropped the phone, my heart racing. My body felt heavy, like I had been drained of all energy. I looked around the room, half expecting the walls to start closing in again, but everything stayed still. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, barely noticeable, but there, coming from the walls, the humming. The house wasn't done with me. It never would be. I was part of it now, and I wasn't ever leaving again.